Hey, it's Silver, and this is 8-Bit Adventures 2. This is an indie JRPG that's going for a kind of melding of different mechanics and ideas, going back to the Super Nintendo days all the way up to roughly the PS1 era of classic JRPGs, with, in my opinion, a notable stop-off in Game Boy Advance land for the art style. I think a sort of greatest hits of classic JRPG ideas is a good way to describe this game because it takes from a lot of games, but it doesn't assume the mantle of any one of them specifically. It is very much its own game, but it is definitely influenced by stuff that the developers have clearly loved throughout their gaming careers. Character-wise, we're going for more of like a Final Fantasy IV or VI kind of idea, as in there's no like job system or anything like that. Instead, you have a set series of named characters that you can actually name, some of them yourself in fact, that each have their own strengths and weaknesses, their own specific equipment types, as well as their own skills that they will all learn in a different order as they level up. So there's quite a bit of familiarity here if you're used to that very classic style of JRPG, but it does have some other interesting, more modern ideas as well, mixed into the way the combat works and the way the progression works. So combat-wise, you have this head-on, turn-based combat style, where every character has a basic attack, usually with some sort of extra feature, like for instance one of the characters can actually vary the strength of their basic attack, with weaker hits being super accurate and stronger hits being less accurate, as well as a sort of secondary character-specific skill that's free to use. It doesn't cost any points from any sort of pool, but is different for every character. Like the warrior character, for instance, has a shield bash that can stun an enemy, and if it does successfully stun someone, then he follows it up with an extra free attack. Or the wizard character, the mage, who has a sort of focus skill that restores about half of his MP in one turn, which is really useful, and also fills up a chunk of the Omega gauge, which is like a party-wide limit break gauge. But of course, in addition to their basic attacks and that character-specific free skill, they also have a selection of other skills that cost either AP or MP to use. Different characters have a different pool, but they basically act as the same thing. They are a resource of points that you spend to use on these special skills. And since every character has their own pretty long list of them that they'll learn as they level up, you are encouraged to switch characters out in and out of your party very frequently. And in fact, the game makes this very clear to you once you get your 6-person party, which is what you'll have for a large chunk of the game, that the switch option does not take a turn, which is basically the game's way of telling you do it as often as you want, because it's actually really useful. You can simply switch a character out for any other character you have in reserves at any given time, and it doesn't take a turn to do so, and you can immediately act with the character that you switched in, and then switch them out again later. So yeah, you're definitely encouraged to keep your party as a very fluid thing, where you're always switching different characters in and out to fit the current situation. I also mentioned that Omega gauge thing, and like I said, that's basically a limit break gauge, but it's for the whole party at once, meaning you don't get one gauge for each character individually. It's just one large gauge, and then once it's full, any of your characters can use their Omega skill to deplete it. And these are usually really, really powerful, like the Thief, for instance, who can basically pin one target down and inflict a whole bunch of damage and status effects all at once, to the character Emma, who is my favorite character in the game, by the way, who basically gets a Final Fantasy VI trance kind of ability where she gets super strong for a couple of turns and has all kinds of crazy magic powers and stuff. All this comes together to mean that the combat is a pretty tactical affair with a lot of character switching, saving of resources, and using specific skills in specific orders for very certain effects on enemies. And this is one of those games where buffs and debuffs are a really huge effect on combat. Kind of like the Shin Megami Tensei games, where stuff like poison is actually really powerful and you can't just ignore it because it does a lot of damage. This game is like that. So stuff like poison and burn, defense decreases, magic defense increases, all those various buffs and debuffs that you can get as characters and inflict on your enemies, they're all really, really powerful, and you gotta pay attention to them, because if you just let your whole party get like frightened or something, that completely halves all of their attack stats, both physical and magical, so you'll be doing like no damage at all, basically. But if you do something like blind an enemy, they'll have a really hard time hitting you, and then you can inflict like a magic defense debuff, which will completely halve their magic defenses and cause you to be able to deal massive burst damage with magic attacks. So it's really necessary to make good use of the status effects in this game in order to actually do the combat efficiently, because enemies are pretty strong in this game. They deal a lot of damage, and in order to be competitive, you have to pay attention to all of these various status effects and use them tactically. The game does have a classic JRPG style big open world map for you to explore with a whole bunch of different areas that you can encounter along the way, and there are some optional areas as well, which is always good, so that you have just some more stuff to explore, some optional places to get sweet loot in and find some crazy rare weaponry and stuff like that. The game has all that stuff that you would expect from a JRPG of this vintage, and is very good at railroading you to the next area in a way that makes sure that you don't get lost easily, while also giving you a fair amount of extra stuff, side quests and hidden secrets and stuff along the side to get yourself stronger if you want to along the way. One thing that's very cool about this game's overall structure is that it's very anti-grinding. There's no grinding in this game at all from what I've found. I found it to be a pretty consistent challenge. It's actually a relatively hard game, but it's not hard because enemies have way better stats than you and you have to sit there for an hour or two grinding on weaker enemies in order to progress. I've never actually encountered something that I couldn't beat with a couple of extra retries and a better strategy. And in fact, to hammer the point home that this game does not have grinding, there are actually no random battles at all. You won't be walking around and have a battle just happen out of nowhere. All of the battles are from enemies that are actually on the maps that you can physically see, and battle starts when you run into them, and once they're gone until you go and rest, which will respawn enemies in different areas. So that basically means that you actually can't really grind in the traditional sense in this game, unless you want to clear out an entire dungeon, go rest at an inn, and trek your way all the way back to the dungeon and clear it out again, which you could theoretically do if you want to, but like I said, so far I found the difficulty curve to be challenging but fair, to the point where I've never actually felt like I was just plain outmatched and needed to defeat a bunch of fodder enemies to get stronger. But even though the combat system is definitely very fun, I think where the game shines the brightest is in its writing and story, because its characters are actually really multifaceted and interesting characters. None of them are tropey, anime-like sort of flat characters that have like one or two dimensions to their overall personality. There's a lot to each of these characters, and they're very well developed throughout the story. Pretty much everyone gets multiple shots in the spotlight to develop their own personalities and stories further, and as you explore with these characters, you will learn more about them in a way that makes them more interesting. The game even manages to characterize its villains in a way that makes them interesting, sort of multi-dimensional characters rather than just evil dudes that want to take over the world. They actually experience character development alongside your characters and change throughout the story, so that by the end they are a bit different than how they started. They seem to understand the world a little bit better, and their overall motivations have sort of changed, and rather than just, I am evil, therefore I want to destroy everything, there's a lot more to them than that actually makes them a little bit more human seeming, because they have more of an arc, a story that makes more sense than just evil thing that wants to kill everyone. But overall, I've been really surprised with the writing throughout various important story beats in the game and stuff, because it's really solid. If a game with this quality of writing was released back in the Final Fantasy 4-6 days, it would have been an instant classic, I feel, and we would still be talking about it today, along with those games as one of the greats of that era. I think the writing is actually that good. But as you go through the story, you will collect a cast of really interesting characters and understand their motivations a little bit better as you continue to explore with them and they sort of talk to each other. And one thing that's always a bit difficult with a very party-based JRPG like this is making sure every character speaks to every other character in a way that they all feel like one cohesive group unit rather than just some people that are traveling together. And this game manages to do that really, really well by having multiple important story beats that make all of the characters actually interact with each other and do things in such a way that the characters tend to develop off of each other, by which I mean they actually affect each other as if they were humans traveling together, and thus their personalities sort of rub off on each other and they learn things from each other and they actually develop together, which seems obvious in hindsight to make characters do that, but that doesn't mean it's easy to do. It's actually relatively difficult to have a cast of 6+ characters that all feel equally important in the story, but also all feel like they're equally learning things from each other together. And this game actually manages that really well. And in fact, towards the latter half of the game, you'll be surprised by how the story actually changes, how the villain changes, and how the focus of who the sort of main characters, in quotes, because, everyone's technically a main character, but who the sort of big focus of the story actually becomes later on. Presentation-wise, the game pretty much nails it down right from the outset with a really solid art style that's very colorful and nice looking, but also fits a sort of classic JRPG color palette in a lot of ways. And like I said earlier, it kind of reminds me of Game Boy Advance style graphics. but at the same time as you have these nice, colorful, almost chibi-like sprites on the world map and stuff, in battle you have a more impressive, sort of fully developed sprite work style. The enemies are very detailed sprites and they look really nice. They even have some really smooth animation sometimes, like later on you'll face these zombie soldier enemies that will actually stab themselves and become ghosts if you let them get to low health but don't kill them in time. And the whole area has actually been my favorite area in the game. It's a very like feudal Japan themed area. The music there is great, but all of the artwork in that area, it has this really like spooky, unsettling vibe, and the oddly smooth animation mixed with the chunky sprite work makes for this really nice sort of horror experience, and I think it nails the atmosphere of that area super well. And pretty much every area is like that. They all have a very specific theme to them, and all the sprite work for the enemies and the environments in those areas are really detailed in the right ways that add to the atmosphere that each area is trying to achieve. Also important to the atmosphere, of course, is the music, and like I mentioned just a minute ago with the Anbu feudal Japan style area, the music in this game is really good. From beginning to end so far, I've found it to be a very memorable soundtrack that's got that classic chiptune style, but it also knows what to do with it, to the point that every area's atmospheric music is really, really nice. And the battle music is great, and also there's some really like heartstring plucking music in certain story beats that really adds to the character development that's happening at the time. And overall, I'd say the soundtrack to this game is definitely a very memorable one, and it makes sense that you can get it separately, because this is the sort of soundtrack that you would actually want to spin on a regular basis in the background or during streams or whatever, because it's just a really good one. This is also a very substantial game, I should mention. There's a lot of gameplay here. I'm currently about 25 hours into the experience, and I'm not actually done yet. I still have quite a bit to do, a whole bunch of optional stuff to explore, entire optional character side quests that are specific to each character that developed them even further, all that stuff to do, so there's still a lot to be done. The game is supposed to have a roughly 30 to 40 hour runtime, which is really substantial for a game like this, especially when you consider this game is completely anti-grinding, which means that 30 to 40 hours is all progression, side quests, new content. It's not repeated old content because you're grinding for 4 or 5 total hours throughout the experience to beat a certain boss or whatever. I also feel the need to mention the boss fights, by the way, because they're really fun. They're extremely detailed, really nice looking sprite work in battles, but they're also really hard. I found that a lot of the bosses in the game so far have been very challenging, and there are several that have actually taken me multiple tries, not because I was underleveled, but because they just had a lot of attacks to learn, and it took me a minute to figure out the best strategy to actually defeat them. And that's the cool thing about the bosses, is that they have a lot of moves they can do, and there's a certain almost puzzle-like strategy that you can do to have a better chance. That doesn't mean there's only one way to beat each boss, especially not with 6 total characters in your party, but it just means that there are certain synergies that you can use with each character that work really well, and that you might need to learn for each boss. There are even some character-specific combo attacks, where one character can partner with another character. It takes some resources from each one, but they do some sort of special attack together, almost Chrono Trigger style, and you will learn these as you go throughout your adventure and the characters grow together. And this means the boss fights basically act as really effective final exams for the area that they appear in, sort of pulling together all the various mechanics that you had seen throughout that area or that dungeon, and then making a much more difficult, sort of amplified version of them in the boss battle. And I think that's a really good strategy for memorable JRPG boss battles, because they make you think tactically, they make you use all of your characters and all of your skills in interesting ways, they make you actually pay attention. And so far, even the more easy bosses that I've faced, none of them were actually pushovers. None of them were so easy that I could have just spammed attack and won automatically. They all had enough mechanics and interesting attacks and things to make them threatening in some way. So all this comes together to mean that yes, I very much do recommend 8-Bit Adventures 2 as a JRPG experience for people that really like classic JRPGs, for people that want a more modern, fun RPG to try, something different. It's just extremely solid and is actually a really good game to sort of start the year out with in the JRPG genre that I really, really like, because it's always fun to see developers make something that reminds them of stuff they used to like, classics, but also not being completely stuck in the past, and instead improving a lot of quality of life aspects and things, and moving the more modern RPG genre into it as well, and sort of melding them together in, like I said earlier, kind of a greatest hits of the different classics that they enjoyed, combined with some newer ideas and mechanics that make for a more streamlined but still really tactical and interesting experience. I would go so far as to say this is definitely a must-play for anyone that likes JRPGs or liked JRPGs back in the day, because it does do a good job of combining both old and new. So I will link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can check this game out for yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.